Welcome everyone to Washington Crossing Historic Park. My name is Kim McCarty. I'm the curator here, and I am thrilled to have all of you joining us, all of our online participants. And before we get started, I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping here. First is a recording statement for our visitors who are joining us via live stream. This session is being recorded for training and record-keeping purposes. By participating in this session, you are consenting to the recording, retention, and use of this session. At any time, if you have a question or comment, feel free to place it in the chat box and we will respond to you as soon as possible. If you would like your question or comment to verbally, please note that by doing so, you are consenting to the recording, retention, and use of your statements as recorded as part of this session. That said, I do want to let you know that we're actually not taking verbal questions from our online audience. So if you have any questions at any time, please put it in the chat. And we are going to have a Q&A after the presentation, and we will get to everybody's questions at that point. I'd also like to ask everyone to please silence or turn off your cell phone so we don't have any interruptions on the recording for that. So to start, I don't know how many folks here know this, but Washington Crossing Historic Park is a Pennsylvania state park. And we are administered by the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources. And we are very lucky to have their support for this program. This is our Juneteenth commemoration, and it is a program that the Friends of Washington Crossing Park just started recently. So it is gaining its support, and it's a wonderful opportunity for partnerships in the community. And we are lucky enough to have some of our DCNR executive staff joining us today. We have our Deputy Secretary Claire Jantz, DEIB Director Arlene Marshall-Huckensmith, and Press Secretary Wesley Robinson. And of course, as always, our Park Manager, Corey Shannon. But before we get started, I'd like to introduce Deputy Secretary Claire Jantz to the stage.
Thank you, Kim. Hello to those joining us online and to those of you here in person. I'm, as Kim said, I'm Deputy Secretary Claire Jantz. I'm Deputy Secretary of Conservation and Technical Services, where I oversee the Bureau of Recreation and Conservation, the Pennsylvania Geologic Survey, and also our Conservation Landscape Program. One of the programs in the Bureau of Recreation and Conservation is our heritage area, and we are in the Delaware and Lehigh National Heritage Corridor in addition to being at one of our state parks. So I wanted to certainly extend a thanks to the staff at Washington Crossing for hosting us. Thank you to the Friends Group for organizing this. And I also want to again recognize the DCNR staff who are here. They're the ones who really kind of get the work done on the ground. So, so thank you for your work. And thanks to you all for giving me a few minutes to speak with you. It's a real honor to be here for this Juneteenth celebration. I'm really looking forward to hearing the remarks from Matthew White and Linda Sally. So I won't take up too much time, but I do want to talk just a little bit about Juneteenth, which marks the time in 1865 when freedom reached the last enslaved African Americans in Galveston, Texas. That was 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. And while today we can watch politicians fight online in real time, that was certainly not the case in 1865. We'll be learning more about Juneteenth from Linda Sally, but this is an important day to mark and to celebrate. Although it wasn't until 2021 that we began to recognize Juneteenth as a public holiday. That's when many Americans learned of the significance of Juneteenth, and many of us are still learning about this time in history. I'm sure many of you share this sentiment, but I believe that African American history is American history. Like Juneteenth, though, many pieces of our shared history can be quickly forgotten or erased. And that's why it's important to come together every year, share stories, and celebrate so that we renew our commitment to the ideals of Juneteenth every year. Juneteenth invites us all to better understand the diverse experiences that shape our communities and our country. It's also a chance to ask ourselves, who feels seen, who feels heard, who feels included in the places that we care for, and who hasn't always felt that way. You may be wondering, as an agency that's known for its 124 state parks and 2.2 million acres of state forest, why Juneteenth is important to DCNR, but it's actually central to our mission. In our state constitution, Article 1, Section 27, it states that people have a right to clean air, pure water, and to the preservation of the natural, scenic, historic, and aesthetic value of the environment. As trustees of these resources, the Commonwealth shall conserve and maintain them for the benefit of all the people, And so in response to that call to action that's put forth in the environmental amendment, DCNR has made diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging a strategic priority. We brought on Arlene Marshall Hawkinsmith to be the director of DEIB, and under her leadership, we've launched Mosaic. This represents our staff-driven and people-focused effort to create a culture where all feel valued, respected, and can contribute. This includes a commitment to make our programs, services, and places more welcoming and accessible to all, just like all the pieces of a mosaic fit together to make a greater whole. Mosaic is about removing barriers that have made it harder for some people to enjoy our natural places, things like language access, transportation, and physical accessibility. At DCNR, we're working to create a more inclusive programs, hire a more diverse workforce, and improve how we engage with all communities across the space. Mosaic is also about creating a culture where all people feel like they belong, where their experiences are respected, and where their stories are part of the bigger picture of who we are as a state and as an agency. For many years, the stories that we've shared about our public lands have only reflected a part of our history. One way that we are implementing our Mosaic goals is by uncovering and sharing untold stories so that all people can connect their history to public lands. We'll be hearing one of those stories today from Matthew White, and I'm looking forward to learning about honoring and respecting the contributions of military and civilian people of color who contributed to Washington's crossing of the Delaware River. DCNR is working to make a space to listen to more voices and tell more complete stories, including the rich cultural heritage of Black Pennsylvanians and other underrepresented communities who have deep connections to the land. Land always has a story, and we need to learn all of the stories about the land. In concrete terms, at this park, we're in the process of, we're actually in the design phase of an ADA interpretive trail of the crossing as part of our efforts to commemorate America's 250th anniversary. Our goal is to more properly depict diversity within the illustrations that will be shown on several interpretive panels. This diversity includes people of color and women. Tentative installation for that trail is summer 2026, next summer, and I'm looking forward to coming back and seeing, excuse me, how that turns out. So at DCNR, we want all communities to feel seen and heard and reflected in our places and spaces and the stories that we tell, and we're proud to be on this journey. and it is a journey. Arlene always says it's progress, not perfection. So we're working on it. Thank you again. And I'll turn the mic back over to Kim to introduce Matthew White.
I'd like to take this opportunity to thank some people and some organizations. First, I want to thank the National Park Service. This project is a part of a grant entitled Calling Forth the Legacy of Jacob Francis, the Revolutionary Road to the Civil Rights Movement. It is funded by a National Park Service grant called the African American Civil Rights Grant. So thank you to the National Park Service. I'd also like to thank the Friends of Washington Crossing Park. They are DCNR's partners at this park. And when I came to them with an idea for a project, they listened to me. They graciously agreed that this was a study, a project whose time had come, and they supported this by applying for the NPS grant. So thankful to the Friends of Washington Crossing, the President, John Godziba, and Executive Director, Jennifer Martin. And last but not least, there are two people who I want to thank on whose scholarship all of this is a bedrock. The first is Larry Kidder, who wrote a magnificent book called The Revolutionary World of a Free Black Man, Jacob Francis. And a lot of the support that we were able to garner for this project came from his scholarship. So thank you, Larry. And the other person is John Rees, who is also an author and has done a lot of scholarship in this field. He wrote this book, They Were Good Soldiers, and the work of both of you has been an inspiration for this, and the work of other scholars. There are other works out there that are definitely worth your time to explore. So our speaker, Matthew White. Matthew White is a historian who focuses on slavery, abolitionism, and politics in the Revolutionary period. His current work focuses on policies regarding people of color in the armies of the American Revolution. He has an MA in history from Rutgers University and is in the process of earning his PhD from the Ohio State University. Mr. White was a consultant for the Museum of the American Revolution's award-winning 2023 exhibit, Black Founders, the Fortin Family of Philadelphia. His papers and presentations include Pennsylvania stood firm as a rock, the revolutionary origins of Pennsylvania's Missouri crisis, and To the Freedom of Infants Hereafter Born, exploring the revolutionary origins and memory of Pennsylvania's 1780 Abolition Act. It is my great pleasure, my great honor to welcome Matthew White to the podium.
Hello, thank you for joining us this fine afternoon. I wanted to start by making a one connection to June 19th, 1865. And that connection is that one of the people who actually read the proclamation that day was a division commander of the 13th Corps by the name of James Richard Slack. And this matters to us because James Richard Slack was born not that far away from where we're standing. And he was the grandson of a person who was purported to have been one of the people who ferried the army that fine night, that fine Christmas night in 1776. I have grown deeply skeptical of any claims to have ferried the army that night, but his grandfather's claim, it's James Slack, is an earlier claim, and indeed he was one of the operators here at McConkey's Ferry. In fact, when Washington referred to this ferry about a month after, he did refer to it as Slack's Ferry. So, you know, he wasn't the greatest guy, but indeed, that is his grandson. But as these connections go to this place, to there, I'd say that's, you know, interesting coincidence. Furthermore, at least some of the people who were here that night that were people of color were either in ships outside of Galveston, or in a few cases, perhaps in Galveston with the 1 brigade of the 25th Corps who actually was in Galveston that day. So, and one of them is the name of Edward Kelsey, who was a grandson of a free person of color from Newtown, who was here during the Revolution. So, with that in mind, moving on to the topic at hand, and that is the forgetfulness of people about people of color in the Revolution. In 1907, a newspaper editor in Portsmouth, New Hampshire said, "Cheers to Prince Whipple, the only man of color in the New Hampshire line during the War of the Revolution." That's insane, unbelievably silly and dumb, and whatever words you want to describe to it. But it's typical, very, very typical. And there's lots of reasons why it was typical. One reason is because the existence of people of color in the armies of the Revolution and the War of 1812 was a threat to slavery. And it needed to be sort of set aside. There are other reasons, some more nefarious or less nefarious, but one of the largest reasons is the persistence, perpetuation of slavery. So we know that's not the case, but how do we get there, and how do we get to where we are now? And going into this project, one of the things that was said in the historical literature is that, as David Hackett Fisher wrote, at the time of the crossing, the only integrated regiment in the Continental Army was Glover's Marblehead Regiment, or it was the first integrated regiment. But, well, to be a first or the only, you have to ignore lots of other people that we know about. Like, for instance, Jacob Francis, and there's a person in the audience who wrote a book on Jacob Francis, as we just heard, who was in a different regiment. But beyond that, it's the main reason, I think, that people believe that is a misreading of the laws governing the enlistment of people of color in 1775 and 1776. So on May 20th, 1775, The Committee of Safety of the Massachusetts Bay Colony resolved that it is of the opinion of this committee, as the contest now between Great Britain and the colonies respects the liberties and the privileges of the latter, which the colonies are determined to maintain, that the admission of any persons as soldiers into the army now raising, but only such as are freemen, will be inconsistent with the principles that are to be supported and reflect dishonor on the colony, and that no slaves are to be admitted to this army upon any consideration whatever. July 10th, so note, it says no slaves, because it's, in their minds, deeply hypocritical to allow masters to enlist their slaves to fight for them in the army. Around July 10th, 1775, Horatio Gates, the newly minted Adjutant General of the Continental Army, circulated parental orders to the recruiters of the Massachusetts Bay Forces. The language sort of mimics the Massachusetts Bay language. The cause that is best that can engage men of the courage and principle to take up arms, but add a new categories of people who are not to be enlisted. You are not to enlist any British deserters, any strollers or vagabonds, and nor any Negro. Does anyone want to translate what that order means? Nor any Negro? Anyone have any guesses, perhaps? Yep. So yeah, that's one translation is that Black people didn't fight, or they wouldn't be allowed to join. And thank you so much for joining me for this presentation. And I'll be able to talk questions, answer questions afterwards. It's been great. Thanks so much. But so it says no Negroes are to be enlisted, but the day after these were circulated, and the days after, and the weeks after, people like Prince Sutton joined the army. People like Prince Negro, and these names are, these are the names of people of color, and Prince Negro in particular is probably an enslaved person. But there's a New Hampshire recruiter wrote at the time, well, we've gotten many able-bodied men, but many of them are slaves. So should we accept them? So the problem was slaves. In September of 1775, Richard Smith noted but that's no. And this gets debated, and Georgia and South Carolina try to force the issue that it means both free and enslaved, but they're shot down. They're voted, that is voted down. So it officially does not mean, it does not include free people of color. So going on into 1775, the Continental Army is sort of in a crisis of enlistment, also crisis of perception. Lots of people are worried that the presence of people of color in the army makes the army look bad to Europeans. It makes the New Englanders in particular look like hypocrites to some of the Virginians and Pennsylvanians because it appears that they're enlisting their slaves to fight for them. So they effectively vote to Congress suggests that they do not enlist free or enslaved Negroes. And then the Continental Army goes along with that. But very, very quickly, officers in the Continental Army respond, well, you know, those lines about the not old men, the no old men, the no boys, yeah, that's really the thing that we need to like actually abide by. The Negroes thing, no, we don't, because the old army, that is the French and Indian War, they're good soldiers and they're of age and they're able-bodied. They're not old men, they're not boys. So why wouldn't we enlist them? And with the threat of Dunmore's rebellion, and officers and people of color themselves pleading their case, Washington moves that free Negroes be re-enlisted for the coming year. And that's where the historians generally think that this stops. But it doesn't. January 24th, 1776, neither Negroes being slaves, in parentheses, old men or boys are to be allowed to pass muster. So again, Negroes in this case it effectively means slaves. Then February 21st, 1776, Washington issued new orders that expressly forbid enlisting any boys, old men, or slaves. So they'd come full circle in a year, effectively, or less than a year, to using the word slaves to differentiate. And as 1776 continued, Washington's correspondence regarding enlistment in the Army, he never mentions Negroes in 1776 in regards to the Army again. He does complain about old men and boys because effectively he understands that they are perfectly fine soldiers, especially compared to old men and boys. He's a pragmatist, if nothing else. And as disaster upon disaster piles up, going into 76, the states begin to allow the enlistment of slaves to fill up emergency regiments to go to the help of the aid of the army around New York. And Massachusetts passes a law, it's effectively a new innovation, and that is any ship that's captured in the high seas that has enslaved people in it, those enslaved people, the men who are of age, but they will be freed. Everyone will be freed. But the men who are of age will be encouraged to enlist in the Continental Army or Navy. Several months later, Cuba, a quote, according to the deposition, a Negro woman writes a letter to the Massachusetts Council of Safety. Cuba, a Negro woman of whom about 25 years of age, who was taken on the high seas in a Weymouth packet by the Oliver Cromwell sloop of war, commanded by Captain Seth Harding, and brought to Boston, that she is rejoiced that she is in the land of liberty, where she hopes to spend her life in comfort and freedom. That, however, the officers of the Oliver Cromwell want to make her their own property, and the lieutenant, one Chapman, of the same ship, after abusing the council and all concerned for her in a most scurrilous manner, swore that he did not believe God ever made a Negro, and that in spite of all courts and persons whatsoever, he would have her sold as a slave and sent to Jamaica next week, in consequence of which she is so confined at a house in Jamaica Plains in this state, as that she is scarcely permitted to see or speak to any person whatsoever. Your distressed petitioner, therefore, in the most humbling manner, flies to your honors for relief and earnestly prays that you would be pleased in your great goodness to commiserate her deplorable case by ordering that she should be considered and treated as being within the true intent and meaning of the act of the Honorable General Court of the State, September 16th, 1776, respecting Negroes taken on the high seas and brought in here as therein expressed. And the council sided with her. They believed that, in fact, it did cover all enslaved people taken as prizes on the high seas. This crisis fully manifests the crisis of recruiting, but also the crisis within the Army and the losses inflicted on the Army. It manifests and doesn't quite culminate, but right out there on the banks of the Delaware. Going into 1777, Congress suggested that states, one of the ways that states could fill their quotas for enlistment that year was by having masters enlist their slaves as substitutes into the Army. And many states, including New Jersey, do that. But New England states do that in particular, and very quickly they add stipulations to this that the person who is enrolled should get their freedom and pay, but other states don't do that. But in some of these states, contemporaries stated that this was one of the key factors in abolishing slavery in Connecticut and New Hampshire and some other New England states. So effectively, the crisis that's out our, we can sort of, that culminates right out there is one of the things that's leading to that. And the other thing is that it's the service of people of color at this time that also forces Congress's, well, not their hand, but they're okay with enslaved people fighting for their freedom, and the states apparently are as well. So as it turns out, in fact, there was nothing barring the enlistment of free people of color in 1776. There certainly, and the other thing is, lots of slaves were enlisted, and also lots of slaves were brought as servants into the Army. But to set the table, I think for us now is to take a step back and talk about slavery in Bucks County and people of color in Bucks County and what was taken for granted in Bucks County by people, and taken for granted by people in the Continental Army. And that is that, of course, there were people of African ancestry. Of course, there were people of Native American ancestry. Of course, there are people of European ancestry. And somewhat more remarkable to at least some of these people is there are people of, we'll say, East Asian ancestry. And there are people who are Jews, and there are various Christians and non-believers, and there are Muslims, and there's Muslims likely in the Continental Army, and there's likely a Muslim, practicing Muslim in Hunterdon County by the name of Omar Jupiter, lives right across the river during the time. And they have found Islamic medals at Mount Vernon, as well as Fort Roberto in the deep recesses of Pennsylvania's hinterlands. That that person was there during the war. So $8 reward, ran away at Newport, Rhode Island. An East India man, slave, named Frank. East India man, interesting. Run away from subscriber the second week of May 1st, a servant man named John Newton, about 20 years of age. is an Asiatic Indian by birth. John Newton, very likely, the runaway ad is from the early summer of 1776. A John Newton joined the 6th Virginia Regiment in September of 1776. The 6th Virginia Regiment was stationed right here at McConkey's Ferry in December of 1776. There's the thin possibility that John Newton was here. Francis Britton certainly was in Jackson's Massachusetts Regiment in 1777. It appears that he was in the service earlier. I'm not sure, because the problem is there is this gigantic dearth of documentation. But many of the muster rolls for most of the Continental Army just don't exist. But his enlistment date, it's a possibility that he was here as well. And John Newton, even if this is not the same John Newton, we do know that John Newton joins the 2nd New Jersey in 1779, and in a surviving descriptive list, it says, you know, hair black, skin yellow, born in Bengal. So yes, I mean, people of even East Asian ancestry would not have been that remarkable to people, because this is a fully interconnected world. The trading is going on, and the Moravians, for instance, had at least one of the people in Bethlehem in the 1760s into the 1770s was named by the name of Samuel Johannes, who was born in modern-day Sri Lanka and was described as a Malay, which can mean a couple of different things, but effectively, I mean, again, he's quote unquote East Asian. So there are certainly people from the modern day India subcontinent that we can be sure of. For the majority of people of color, including people with Native American ancestry in Bucks County at this moment, the majority were enslaved. Slavery was normal. It was becoming less normal, and there was one wave of Quaker manumissions starting in the 1760s, which are not well documented, but I believe that at least a person I just spoke about, his grandfather, well, Edward Kelsey's grandfather was Cuff Kelsey, and he appears to have been freed around 1767, possibly by a Quaker. Another person is John Francis. John Francis was apparently from Solebury Township, and shows up. He's one of the first cases mentioned in the records of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, which is turning 250 years old very soon. He eventually joins the army and is badly wounded at the Battle of Brandywine, but he is in the middle of purchasing the freedom of his wife, who lives in Newtown. And the person who provided security for the bond, for the purchase, and who also helped him get his pension was William Neely, who is one of the people who lives, I mean, Thompson Neely House. The Neely is William Neely. So John Francis is probably connected to that house as well, but John Francis for sure was likely here during the crossing period, and I suspect probably participated because he joined the Continental Army right after with people who definitely had participated. So there's a wide group of manumissions, but a lot of these manumissions happen after the fact, after the crossing. And the people we know about include Dinah, aged unknown, but she was enslaved at Beaumont's Ferry, which is modern day Brownsburg, likely in the ferry house, which still exists. She was probably participated in this. John Burroughs emancipated or manumitted Aaron, age 24, and Moses, age 23. John Burroughs's property is one property back from where we're standing. It connects. They undoubtedly participated in the encampment and possibly with the crossing. Bernard Van Horn, enslaver, owned Cupid, 40 years old, Betty, 48. Van Horn property is an adjacent property. And again, so they're right here. And their children are here. And one of those children is named Mary Bartram, and she was not enslaved. She was actually an apprentice, but she was an apprentice of John and Mercy Chapman. And John and Mercy Chapman lived with the Chapman Farm or London Purchase Farm, and that's sort of over that way, which no one can see on TV. But that was the headquarters for Henry Knox, and Hamilton was there. So little Mary Bartram likely at least interacted with Henry Knox and Alexander Hamilton. And it's very, very likely, which we will talk about, that at least some of these people I've just mentioned helped to ferry the army that night. So, moving on to the army. In the army, there are likely, a conservative estimate is at least 100 enslaved people acting as servants of different kinds. The most famous servant, personal servant, waiter, is Billy Lee, who's Washington's enslaved person. He's in this is Thomas Sully's The Passage of the Delaware from 1819, and Billy Lee's face apparently has gotten somewhat washed out, I guess, in the restorations. But supposedly he's the more visible, which is unfortunate that he's not. But there he is. You can see him behind supposed to be Nathaniel Greene, but to the right of Washington. There's a person who had multiple servants with him throughout the war, enslaved servants, was Colonel John Glover, commanded a brigade. This is Caesar Glover, and Caesar Glover gave a little bit of a life story to a writer, and there it is. Taken captive in Africa and brought as a slave. And you will notice at the very end, he says, if he had a choice to live here in the United States, or, he says he wishes that he could go back and, live in Africa, and he'd never been stolen. So, he got his freedom. He received his freedom after the war, but for most of the war, yeah, he was an enslaved person with General John Glover. Hannah Till. Hannah Till was an enslaved person from Delaware that was effectively indentured at the beginning of the war, and she purchased her freedom in 1778, I believe. So when she was here, she was still a servant, well, indentured servant or enslaved. But one of the questions that comes up with Hannah Archer Till is, where might she have been on the day of the 25th? And she gave a pension deposition to Pennsylvania, and she stated, you know, we're at Long Island, White Plains, Trenton, Princeton. There is a few pension depositions and other assorted evidence that suggests that while there weren't many women camp followers or women with the Army, a few were, and some were here in McConkey's, waiting it out effectively for the operation across the Delaware to be over. But in all probability, Hannah Till was here on the 25th into the 26th, if nothing else, cooking for Mr. Nervousness himself, George Washington. So, and here is another example of an enslaved person with the Army. So this person's enslaver was Jehu Ayer. Jehu Ayer was effectively the commander of the Philadelphia Artillery Battalion that was tasked with repairing boats and ferrying boats and moving boats. And Jehu Ayer brought his enslaved person with him, named Julius, well, according to him, but goes by the name Alexander Bruce. He left his master's service the 26th of December, 1776. Huh, that's fascinating. I don't think anything happened that day, so I think we just write that off as just weird, whatever. But right, what happens is that he used the opportunity either at Trenton Ferry or possibly here to run away from his master. And then apparently joined the Pennsylvania Navy. So one thing I want to say right now is that one of the things that's come out of this project is the importance of the Pennsylvania Navy. And just to say, yes, Pennsylvania had a Navy that was mainly there to defend Philadelphia. Just in case you don't know what it is. How many people are not proud of the Pennsylvania Navy? Ah, geez. But he joins the Pennsylvania Navy, and he enlists under Captain Roach on the Dickinson. The thing is, Captain Roach and the Dickinson were up at Trenton for a lot of the month of December. And the Pennsylvania Navy went up and down the river, ferrying people, supplies, firing on British soldiers, firing on Burlington. They were doing lots of stuff. And they were also supplying extra people for the Army. Ned Hector, who is a person that some people may or may not know, but eventually he's in the Pennsylvania State Artillery. But his appearance on muster rolls in February and March of 1777 suggests in the Pennsylvania State Artillery Regiment was that he was in the Pennsylvania Navy during this time period, and then was effectively chosen to go into the Pennsylvania State Artillery because he already had experience with it, because of what he had done during this campaign. So, but yeah, so Alexander Bruce, as he wanted to be called, and we should always, you know, note what people want to be called versus what other people want to call them. Alexander Bruce apparently had friends in the Pennsylvania Navy and associated with these people in this galley. And there's other people that I found on the same galley who are also enslaved people seeking freedom, who apparently were also effectively hidden on the Dickinson galley. And what that little, in the bottom picture is, that those are images of the galleys. There was 13 galleys built. And, you know, they're pretty cool looking, I think. And I don't know if anyone's been following you know, the news. I don't even know if this is news to most people, but the gunboat at Ground Zero, it's now entered the New York State Museum. 95% certainty that that is a Pennsylvania Navy galley. That perhaps even the Dickinson, perhaps Alexander Bruce was there himself. But yeah, I mean, all likelihood, this galley was at least, you know, was there December 8th to watch, to cover the retreat across the Delaware. It might even be up here December 30th. It's pretty amazing, honestly, that that's what it is. I was looking for a person, you know, a person of color who is a camp follower as an example, and I was just going to use Rachel and Bob as an example of the sort of person who might have been here. But there's another version of this sort of famous story, and in it, this other version, it says, stolen by a soldier these last 2 years. And he's writing this in October, November of 1778. And the person in question is Mordecai Gist, who was then the major of the 1st Maryland Regiment. He had taken his enslaved person into the service with him, and he'd become grievously ill in October. And apparently, Rachel just stayed with the regiment. And the regiment, as she says, the soldier, as Mordecai Gist says, the soldier who stole her, was in the 1st Maryland, and the people who were perfectly happy with her existence of being there were also in the 1st Maryland. And then Mordecai Gist was sent to Maryland to recruit a new regiment as colonel. So 2 years after the fact, he's still trying to recover Rachel, but with no luck. And I suspect he never had luck in this case. But that is an illustration of Rachel and Bob done for John Reese's book, who's right down there. So a lot of pensions, came out during this. Some old chestnuts, of course, like Jacob Francis's, but one of the most remarkable, I think, was that of Siemens is probably the pronunciation of last name. I, Silas Goodall of Norwich, aforesaid on oath declare that I was lieutenant in Colonel John Durkee's regiment in the year 1776 in the Continental Army, and that I well recollect the aforesaid Lycus Seaman, a black man in said service. He was engaged in the battle at Trent, December 1776. I particularly recollect seeing him and 2 of hessian brothers in that battle, which I remember from the circumstances of one of them having fired at and missed, and the other firing and killing, in my opinion, a Hessian, at whom he took particular aim. I had seen and known Lycus before in said army. That's as vivid pension descriptions go, depositions go, I think that's one of the most vivid I've ever found. And yes, he had 2 brothers in service, Prentice and Hewitt, and one of them did not survive the war. So when I first read that, I was just sort of had trouble translating the pension, but when I did, I'm like, oh, oh boy. And then we go to another source group, and that is, this is a loyalist. This is a petition to the British Crown for money effectively lost by serving in the British Army. But it's also a statement of service for here. And that is John Twine, a black. He was served Captain Fitzgerald, and Captain Fitzgerald There were two Captain Fitzgeralds. One was, or at this point, John Fitzgerald, who was serving with Washington. The other is Captain John Fitzgerald of the 5th Virginia Regiment, who was stationed right here. Apparently, John Twine used he felt as if he was poorly clothed. He was very cold. I can't understand why he might feel that way. In the December of 1776, he used the opportunity around January 2nd to run away to the British. But in the meantime, he was here and probably crossed the Delaware on the 25th and 26th. Other little nuggets popped up in the depositions, and one of them is, this is another loyalist, and that is Memorial of Benjamin Whitcuff is a black man and was born on Long Island. At the commencement of the Troubles, he was a farmer. He was born a free man, and his father was a free man as well. The farm he lived on was his father's. His father joined the Americans in 1776 in a New York regiment and was sergeant in one of their regiments. And so he's a black man. He's saying that his father, who was also a black man, was a sergeant. And before this experience, I would have said, that sounds a lot like BS. But because effectively of white supremacy, racism, but there is evidence of several non-commissioned officers of color here at McConkey's Ferry. And the most notable is a guy by the name of John Sidbottom. John Sidbottom, in his pension application, one of his comrades, Charles Lander, says, he was the bravest man I ever had the honor and the satisfaction to know. He also goes on to say that he was my sergeant of my mess, and that he acted as a sergeant. Indeed, he shows up on the rolls as a corporal and a couple times as a sergeant, but he was illiterate, and I suspect what happened was he was demoted for his illiteracy back to corporal. But indeed, he was a sergeant, and what he was remembered most for, but he does not mention in his pension application is that he was one of the people who pulled a future president off the field, James Monroe, Captain James Monroe of the 3rd Virginia Regiment. He was credited with helping to save his life. And the nephew of James Monroe said that how could my uncle ever forget the mulatto Sidbottom brothers, because there's a brother, Joseph, as well. And in the censuses, they kind of bounce around as white and, all other colored free. But so they were apparently they were fairly fair-skinned, whatever that means. But John Sidbottom did not want to bring up Trenton in his pension deposition because he was fearful that he would be outed as a person of color. So he didn't, but other people remembered it. And in one deposition, it said, "Oh, the brave mulatto, John Sidbottom." So, person of mixed ancestry. I hate the term mixed ancestry. Ugh, God. But a person of Native American, African, European ancestry. And other stuff comes out as well. So in the inspection roll of Negroes, which is so-called the Book of Negroes from 1783 in New York, there are a few notations in there that relate to Bucks County. And one of them is that Silas, former owner, William Pettit, operator of a ferry. The ferry north of us was called Beaumont's Ferry, Pettit's Ferry, Cox's Ferry, but contemporaneously to this, Beaumont's and Pettit's. And William Pettit was the operator. William Pettit had at least enslaved seven people. As it turns out, one of the things that came out in this project was that it was a tradition on the Delaware and elsewhere for people to buy ferries and then to have enslaved people operate the ferries. So in newspapers, there is a pretty consistent clip of "to be sold, stout, healthy, young Negro man who has been accustomed to attend at a ferry, has had the smallpox and is sold for no other reason but want of employ." And we know of many, the most famous enslaved ferry operator and toll taker is Alice of Dunk's Ferry, aka Black Alice. She was said to have helped with the crossings at Dunk's Ferry, which is near Bristol, Burlington. This is the only image of any person a person of color that from around here that I know of. I mean, that's going to be in Bucks County associated with the crossing. And there's lots of evidence in tax records, in people's memories, and also in people's memoirs of enslaved people running ferries. And one of those memoirs is Roger Lamb's memoir. He was a British soldier. And when he was escaping, he crossed at Bristol Ferry, Dunk's Ferry. And if you can see there, it says that basically him and his escapee friends from captivity threatened a Negro ferryman with death to take him across the Delaware. And indeed, he illustrated it. And the Mercer Museum got this image for the Doan exhibit there, which you should all go and see, to say the least. But yes, there is another image of an unknown ferry operator of color. In the course of this research, I found that there was only one claim by a person who actually was at the ferry, who was actually at the crossing, who claimed that he had seen somebody actually helping to ferry the army that night. And that's William R. Green. And William R. Green was the ferry operator at Yardley and Howes Ferry. And if you can use your divine magic to run the lines across from the William Greens and the Richard Green, you'll notice that they run the ferry, they own the ferry, and they have enslaved people. And apparently those enslaved people are men over the age of 20, but are nameless. But William R. Green, as it says, helped to ferry the army across the River Delaware into Pennsylvania. He was with the army, with it at the Battle of Trenton. In all likelihood, those enslaved people were there ferrying the army with him. And but that's the thing is that there's lots of people who are very similar to him that I don't know the names for. Hopefully we will find the names, but they were likely the ferry operators themselves. People did the most of the ferrying, and so therefore they were probably here December 25th, 26th, ferrying the army. Which brings us to Captain then Major John Coryell of Coryell's Ferry, aka New Hope. This is from 1748. This is from King George's War, but John Coryell of Amwell, New Jersey, ran away. A Negro man named James Roos had on soldier's clothing, pretty bare, was lame in one of his knees. Coryell was either in the Jersey Regiment or he had enlisted James as an enslaved soldier. Either way, James, when John Coryell died in 1799, he freed his trusty servant man, James. John Coryell, there is some evidence that John Coryell oversaw the basic ferrying operations at McConkey's Ferry Christmas night. Again, the likelihood is that James and that Coryell's other enslaved people were probably here ferrying the army as well. Does anybody have a guess where this was made, or what this is of? The Bristol 1777 was an old phone number. That's for nobody's laughing. Ah, geez. Okay, well, whatever. It turns out that this is not Bristol 1777. It's 1777, but it's not Bristol. This is Coryell's Ferry. This is the earliest image of New Hope. This is Pennsylvania side looking into modern-day Lambertville. This is where obviously he worked, where the Coryells worked, where the enslaved people worked. It's also the place where James Monroe was supposed to nurse out health. But this is also a depiction of the kind of ferry that was here. So one of the other things that came out in this project was that the people who were stationed here were Stevens Brigade, Adam Stevens Brigade, who was the 5th, the 6th, and the 7th, the 4th, the 5th, and the 6th Virginia regiments, and Captain Thomas Forrest's artillery, Pennsylvania State Artillery Battery. Later, early in 1777, William Livingston, the governor of New Jersey, describes Adam Stevens' brigade as, quote, tawny Jaegers. And there's a lot of reasons why he does it. And one of the reasons is because Adam Stevens himself implied that there were a number of people of color in his brigade, including musty, which is mixed, quote unquote mixed, Native Americans and people of African descent in his brigade. And going through the names of people that were here and also going through people who were described as people of color, yeah, there were a bunch of people who were people of color in that brigade. So the Tawny Jaegers thing, it appears to be an accurate description of Stevens' brigade. The other group that was here was Thomas Forrest, Pennsylvania State Artillery Battery. And they're literally right out there. One of the slavery ends quick, quote unquote, quickly, well, especially quickly compared to where the length of time it takes to end in the Deep South. But for chunks of the revolutionary generation, they hoped that the revolution would exterminate slavery. And then it didn't. And then it grew more powerful, especially to the south of here. And in 1820, Thomas Forrest, who again was right out there, was in Congress and said that the Missouri Compromise would be, he believed it would be the darkest moment of his life because it would show that slavery was not about to end. And he called the Constitution, quote, a compromise to prevent disunion, a dereliction of first principles upon the independence of our country was achieved, It was an acquiescence in the bondage of those of our fellow men in whose services their possessors conceived they had a property. So notice he said fellow men in there. And also in other places he says fellow human beings, fellow beings. In this speech, he goes on to describe the crossing in the Battle of Trenton. And I found that actually, now going through this stuff, his description was actually pretty accurate. He actually even provides insights. But he goes on to say that there are a number of people in Congress with him who are children of people who are here, who are officers in Stevens Brigade. And he is deeply upset by their love of slavery. And so he says, at Trenton, we wore on our uniforms and on our flags the insignia of our cause, inscribed on escutcheons of brass, fixed on their bayonets and sword belts, liberty or death, united we stand, divided we fall. And then on the flag, 'tis for posterity we bleed, for posterity we die. Posterity, he says. Posterity? What posterity perpetuates slavery? I deeply regretted those compatriots who with me in battle fell, whose death I then regretted as premature and unfortunate, snatched as I then thought from a participation in the blessings of a happy independence, in the full enjoyment of every civil and religious liberty. But now I have occasion to rejoice, yes, rejoice over much that they were not, like me, permitted to live to see their posterity outgrow the remembrance of the patriotic virtues of their fathers by an act for the extension of slavery. And then he goes on to say that if slavery grows out of the revolution, out of the republic, then he regretted serving in the army of the revolution. And one of the things he says is when he describes the army there, is he says, we and free men. And Forrest is taking for granted that everyone knows that there were people of color in the army with him at that time, because pretty much everyone of his generation from a certain area, not South Carolina, basically, knew that. And that's basically what this project has shown me, is that they took lots of things for granted. And then in taking stuff for granted, we didn't find out about it. And I'm trying to, and many of us are trying to help recover the actual accuracy of what was actually lived. So, and that's it.
So we have time for only a couple of questions, but does anybody have any questions? All right. No questions?
That's the conservative estimate that is enlisted soldiers here. Conservative estimates 5%. And that I suspect is actually very conservative. And also if we include enslaved servants, put that into the number, put that in there, it's probably at least 10%. The problem is there's just not that much documentation. There's not very, very few descriptive lists. And even so descriptive lists would say hair color, black, complexion, dark, or it might say Negro, or it might say Black. But sometimes for some people that I know, like a guy named Prince, which is typically Prince Africa, like described as dark complected. So there's no hard and fast rules. It's all, even when you have descriptive lists and you can sort of gauge, quote unquote, you know, race or whatever, it's not, but it's a lot. And that's really, it's, you know, that's.
All right, we have one more question.
Just curious how you did the research. Where all did you find it? You know, how do you go about it?
Seer stones and crystals, and a lot of it was returning to like muster rolls, and then finding like, oh, there really aren't that many muster rolls. So there's got to be other ways to do this. And so some of that is trying to find company books, orderly books, other documentation like that. And you get some hints in there. Another way is to find names of people who we do have names in muster rolls, and then pop them into Massachusetts Soldiers and Sailors database. And sometimes they'll be described in a descriptive list, and suddenly like, oh, you know, complexion Black or Negro or whatever. And then we'll have that's one way to do it. But there's all sorts of going through names in censuses, going through names in tax lists. There was a lot of stuff. It was a whole lot of stuff. It's still ongoing.
Thank you very much.
If you have any questions afterwards, I'll be.
All righty, thank you all. Our next speaker is going to talk to us about the significance of Juneteenth and the importance of remembering and teaching African-American history. Our speaker is Linda Sally. She is the president and executive director of the African-American Museum of Bucks County. She is a retired educator from New York City Board of Education, and is a passionate advocate for African-American history, community collaboration, and youth education. And the African-American Museum of Bucks County has developed impactful programs, including educational trips to Washington, D.C., and partnerships with local institutions such as the Mercer Museum and the Peace Center. So please welcome Linda Sally.
Good afternoon, and thank the Washington Crossing team for inviting us and to share this rich history with all. And today, I'm going to introduce you to our historian, our founding member of the African American Museum. He is well known throughout Bucks County. He has done tremendous research on Juneteenth, and no one can tell that story better than Roger Brown. So I'm going to ask Roger Brown to come up and tell you the history of Juneteenth. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I just want to be here, hopefully, to give you some insight on Juneteenth. You know, the name itself is very interesting because I want to share a story with all of you about my father. My father was born in 1929. And when we first heard about Juneteenth, he was very interested wanted to know why. What was it about? What's going on there? And I know some of you here have those same questions. Can I just see by a show of hands how many people learned about Juneteenth or has recently been told about it? Quite a few. But to go on, I want to just basically make some things clear to all of you. On June 19th, 1866, former enslaved people of Galveston, Texas, celebrated a year of freedom with the Juneteenth holiday. Juneteenth celebrations quickly spread to the rest of the country, and the date and times also continue. We have a series of pop-up stand-ups out here in this lobby that if you look at them, it will basically give you a clear picture of what was really going on in Galveston, Texas. You know, I'm only going to give you a non-documented statement about that. Is that why did it take so long for people to get the news in Galveston, Texas? Was it deliberate? Was it planned? Was it intentional? Or was just education just that far out of reach for so many people? You know, we sat here today and witnessed some interesting documents. And I hope that I took the time to try to read a lot of those documents for clarity, for the ability to string words together and make them make sense. Now, in some of this literature, some of the words to me did not make sense, but they were written by high-standing officers, people that were recognized as being intelligent, being noteworthy, but they couldn't string words together to explain themselves. So maybe that's what happened in Galveston, Texas, that nobody could explain themselves to tell these people that slavery was over. So it took time. It took time and involvement of people. Abolitionists had to get involved. People such as Richard Allen, who was a noted religious man. He traveled from church to church here in this Bucks County area. And just to give you, I call a little interest of the African American Museum, we've documented some of this research and travel of Richard Allen through Bucks County, through the churches that he helped start. Mount Gilead has an interesting story about Big Ben, the escaped slave from Maryland, who was captured by the slave catchers here in Bucks County. But the Quakers bought his freedom and brought him back. Robert Purvis was another abolitionist that really worked hard and diligent to put the word out, to educate people of their rights. You know, we're talking about the Constitution. To some people, it does not mean anything, because if we can be slick enough to not tell these people that they're not free people and just keep them working for nothing, keep them afraid to become educated people, because being a slave, you were not allowed to be educated. Being a slave, you did not have certain freedoms and rights. And I heard speak of the manumissions of slavery, which I think that I want to speak from the Quakers' point of view, that they were the rational-minded people. They put their congregation together and said, we're not going to tolerate slavery. Everybody did not accept that. Some people chose their own way of doing things, and that divided a division within their community, and they called it a schism. Frederick Douglass, whom we've heard many stories about, was a diligent free man, but he knew about slavery. And William Still out of Philadelphia, another prominent name in Black history. He worked hard in the Underground Railroad. We talk about the Underground Railroad and people say, oh, was that a train? No, it was not a train. And it was not a highly advertised or publicized situation. It had to be kept quiet. You could not walk through the streets and say, hey, over here we have help for underground runaway slaves. That was not tolerated. You would be a victim of your own kind. That's why they developed laws about slave catchers. They put rewards out for the price of runaway slaves. A lot of things were being done that were inhumane, I felt. I mean, from my interpretation of life, of how people should be treated, what should be happening, or what should be going on. And the church played a great part in that as far as the information being spread around, because you were not allowed to attend school. There were no social events for you to attend in any community whatsoever. You had to go to church or stay within your own community. Slavery was not an easy situation for anyone. But I think that we can study from these pamphlets out here, the pamphlets that we're passing out today. And I think that if you have a question, please pick up one of these pamphlets. It is quite helpful because it shows what is Juneteenth, why was it necessary. We felt that slavery had come to an end, but not everywhere. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine being a part of the United States of America and something's happening in New Jersey, but in Texas, it's unheard of? Do you think that was by plan or design in any kind of way? But I just think that it gives you thought in a lot of these things that have happened along the way. I think that good people are hard to come by, but God has always put good people here on this earth. I think that's why we've been allowed to go forward. That's why we're meeting in a room today, listening to what we are going over, because it's of interest to people. I also want to share another story with you about my grandfather, who was born in Florence, South Carolina, and he was biracial. He looked like Dwight D. Eisenhower to me. A very interesting person, but he was not accepted. He was born in 1898. He was not accepted. And he was created by people that shared the same name as him, but not accepted. And he remained a very quiet man until his death. I thought that was a very interesting combination between my grandparents, because my grandmother was a college-educated woman. She was a nurse, a midwife. But he was a carpenter. And they were different as night and day. She had the voice, he had none. I mean, not that she ruled him or anything, but he just did not go out and deal with business in society. I don't know why. I always wanted to know why. And maybe that's why I dedicated myself to the museum as I have for these many years. And then God has blessed me with 2 biracial grandchildren who have many questions. And they've gone on tours, they've come to the museum, and they've asked questions upon questions about Juneteenth. You know, we had the luxury of having a family reunion in Washington, D.C., and we took them on a tour of Frederick Douglass's house. And my grandson at that time wrote a report about Frederick Douglass. And he, since that day, has always wanted to know where he comes from, who he is, and why things are like they are. And I think that we cannot learn anything, but we must look at Juneteenth and look at the people that have been, I call, co-mingled in our society, that have differences of their identity. You think it might have something to do with mental health that we're having today? And the other issues where people can't find themselves, they can't find their identity. But I don't want to end there. I want to talk about the African Museum here in Bucks County. The African Museum of Bucks County honors its rich legacy and the African American experience, inspiring pride in our heritage, sharing information and stories about the diverse journey of our people and our shared ancestries. Our programs and exhibits explore the history, the heritage of the diversity of cultures of Blacks County and beyond. I want you to come visit our museum once it's up and going. because I think it's going to share some interesting situations of Bucks. You know, we spent a lot of time studying and analyzing things with the Quakers here in Bucks County. And we have a list of manumissions of all the manumitted slaves that were here in Bucks County. And you can't remove yourself from saying you may be related to some of these people through your ancestors. Think about that. Just give that a little thought for a moment. That Grandpop didn't tell me everything he did, every place he went, but he has a history. He had a life. Your great-grandparents had a life. We learn about the walking purchase here in Bucks County. Bucks County is loaded with history. You know, it's just not Penn's Manor. You know, I walk out the back door of Penn's Manor and I look at the Delaware from here to that door, that wall back there. And that was his I-95. That was the expressway for travel at that time. You mentioned about ferries and Dunk's Ferry and other different things. People had to make a way for themselves, and they did pretty good. Necessity makes you become very creative. And I think that with Juneteenth, people have become very creative. But I think we're here now in 2025, and we have more work to do. But I want everyone to, like I said, be aware, know the story of Juneteenth. Was it done by accident? I don't think so. Was it done on purpose? I don't know. I think it's one of those things we have to analyze. But I think that if we use the walking purchase analysis of we're going to walk off as much land and we're going to give it to you, they couldn't settle for that. They had to use tricks. They had to have stationed people so that they can acquire more. Was it greed? Was it graft? Was it dishonesty? Who knows? History. I also asked another question. Why were the enslaved people only listed by their first names? Or how much that we paid for them? Because they were only sought of as chattel, meaning property. There was no interest in God loving another man, God spreading the word of mankind. That did not happen. Those people were not treated that way. And I think Juneteenth to me is a good example of enough was enough. It had to come to light. And I look at the military man that read everything completely. Maybe he was illiterate. You know, we like to use that word literate, illiterate, literacy. Who, reading some of this thing, these people weren't too literate. They might have been accepted in society, but they weren't that literate. So who was your fate held in hands of? Someone that was going to lie, someone that was going to steal, someone that was going to sell you down the river. And those terms are very important. And people use them, but do they really understand what they mean today? Being sold down the river, being sold, period. That's kind of unheard of, you know, and I think that we have to wrestle with them things. But I want to also provide some time for some question and answers of Juneteenth, if there are any in this audience. You know, but it's been a pleasure coming here today. I think that Washington Crossing is a monumental historical place. And I hope that you've gathered something from the museum that we can offer you. And I know that besides St. Mary's on 413 in Langhorne, we will have a building that's going to share all of this knowledge, education, and history with you. And we would like to share it with your families, your children, you know, people that visit you here in Bucks, because we know that a lot of people move all over the place now. They don't have to run away. They move freely across the country, around the world, to another province, to another state. And it's just open for them to do. But here in Bucks, we want to capture the story. African-American history is America's history. It cannot be erased. If we look at things that were built, Washington, D.C. was built and designed by someone, and we know who it was. He was not a Caucasian man. The Art Museum in Philadelphia. There's things all around this world and globe that have been a part of something. The Statue of Liberty was given to us, but it was given to us as a token. And I know that's taking it out of context a little bit, but you look at things and the symbolism of things and a bunch of different other things. And that's why we wanted to share with you our knowledge of Juneteenth this afternoon. And I want to thank you all for being here, and I will leave it at that unless we have questions.
Anyone have a question?
Yes.
Hi, I was just wondering when the museum was expected to open.
We're looking at a realistic date. I'm going to say September, end of September, October. You know, we were really hoping to get in there for Juneteenth. We wanted to have a big grand opening and everything, but you know, construction is very slow. Prices are going up on things, but a very good question. Any others?
Well,
Hello.
New England is often given the example of being a place of strong abolitionist area, but I think people don't know the history of really early abolitionism in Philadelphia and areas. If there could be a collaboration between all of the different sites, you know, an idea I thought of could be a cradle of abolitionism, national heritage area, with places like William Still's houses actually in Philadelphia.
Yes.
And some of the early Quakers, the Germantown sites, the early
Lucretia Mott's area.
Communities like Timbuktu.
Yes.
And Lawnside. I think we need to do a better job of linking all of these sites and promoting our area as being really a cradle of abolitionism in the United States.
And you are exactly right, sir. And I'm glad you brought that point up because you mentioned people, and I want to talk about Lucretia Mott, okay? I also mentioned earlier about Robert Purvis. Okay, Robert Purvis is from this area. Okay, this history, and he was a mulatto, meaning that he was mixed. Okay, that he was mixed with African American and Caucasian, but he chose to be an abolitionist. But what you're saying is very correct, and I hope that in time, and our museum is looking to tell these stories because we connect the churches to Richard Allen. Bethlehem AME on 413 is the first African-American church in this area. If you go in that church and it's wonderful. They have like their own private little museum because they have books of attendance. Because I'm going to say something that was important. If you did not go to church as an African-American, you did not do anything. You were not welcome anywhere else. You know, there was no social gatherings for you out in the community. The church was your only chance. Very good question, sir. Abolitions played a very important part.
Thank you very much. If anyone has any further questions, as you know, we have representatives from the museum are going to be right up here in the Riverview room, and I'm sure they would love to talk to you.
Yes.
So thank you.
And thank
again
you.
very much.
Thank you.
With that, I would like to invite all of you to go out into the Riverview room. We have some exhibits set up for you. Later on, there's going to be a concert for you all to enjoy. So have fun, everyone. Enjoy yourself. Thank you so much for coming.